Welcome to your Left Communist Radio Hour. This is the Footnotes to Endnotes podcast. My name is Uriah Mark Todorov.
And my name is Owen Gilbride. Happy Halloween, everyone.
Happy Halloween. A very spooky episode to you.
Ooh,
also
spooky
also happy election to all of our American listeners.
Yeah, I mean, that's not as important as Halloween, but
not by a long shot.
No.
All right. So we're here to discuss logistics, counterlogistics, and the communist prospects. The first intake in this edition of Endnotes, the first essay written or credited to a definite author, not written by the anonymous collective.
Yeah.
And that author is Mr. Jasper Bernes. A bit infamous at this point, but we don't have to get into that.
Yeah, I mean, if you've watched The Simpsons, you know that he wasn't running that power plant very ethically.
I see. Right. Yes, Mr. Bernes. So Mr. Jasper Bernes, who will be referring to as Mr. Bernes here forward. Yeah, pretty good essay. Very stylistically compelling. It has a pretty clear kind of narrative through line that connects a few different threads throughout it. It's very well woven. There are a few separate ideas going on that are kind of used in a very poetic way to kind of build a theoretical narrative over the course of the essay. The way that he starts out by discussing the role of theory and then connecting it to the Oakland port blockade in 2011. And then constantly going back to that, and then the role of theory is not really the primary topic of the essay, but it is still used to anchor his discussion of logistics, which is really what the essay is about. So, Owen, do you want to give a summary?
This essay is looking at the subject of logistics, specifically referring to logistics under capitalism, the way that modern capitalist manufacturing examines data points aggregated from all over the world in order to try to squeeze the last bit of toothpaste out of the tube, so to speak, in order to try to wring as much profit as possible in a society where profit has been steadily declining for decades. And in examining this, Bernes raises the question then, could a communist or communization movement or any sort of anti-capitalist movement use some form of counterlogistics to fight this process, to effectively move against the capitalist process and the global infrastructure and the shipping routes and things like that? The conclusion he ultimately reaches is that you can't make use of counterlogistics, because logistics itself is a fundamentally capitalist way of viewing the world, and that under a communist system of organization, the sort of logistical insights that capitalism produces would just not be useful. And he gets into detail towards the end of this essay about why that's the case.
Yeah, I had a slightly different reading of the ending. Just the idea of counterlogistics, I think he's using that as kind of a fancy term for something that he calls the blockade, the strike that in 2011 in Oakland at the port, where they 10,000 people, after Occupy Oakland got shut down, they moved to the Oakland port, and it was directed in a way, but it was also pretty kind of spontaneous in another way. But I think the idea of counterlogistics is just referring to a way of fighting against capitalism in the age of logistics by doing blockades, by blocking the flow of commodities. And he talks a lot about just-in-time production, which is like a big buzzword this year. But basically, like the way that capitalism has set itself up since the 70s, since the economic downturn in the 70s, using logistics as a way to, as you say, squeeze the last toothpaste out of the tube. It's a very precarious system. It's very fragile, and thereby it is very vulnerable to these sorts of demonstrations. I think the idea of counterlogistics is just to propose the blockade as a kind of like a perhaps more effective, more relevant to contemporary capitalism method of fighting against the system than the strike, which obviously through like most of the 20th century and the 19th century even, the strike was like the primary way of fighting against capitalism. So let's get into it, and we'll go with our first point here. The he kind of introduces the essay by talking about the relationship of theory and practice, which is like a very classic, age-old little conundrum that radical theorists like to think about to try to figure out how their armchair intellectualizing could possibly have any impacts on the world, possibly contribute to the movements that they are thinking about. And like, again, this is not really like the primary topic of the essay, but he just kind of like sets it up as like a little grounding, a little bit of narrative. And he talks about theory and its relationship to practice, and specifically the kind of practice, and like he I think says that like theory is generally used like post facto to kind of like make sense of practice. It's like used by the practitioners themselves. It's used by people coming along afterwards to kind of make sense of what has happened, and like propose how it can be like maybe systematized for the future. I might be putting a little bit of words into his mouth, but
I have like the very start of the essay that I'm going to read out because I think it really lays out his view on theory well. And this is the very start of the essay. What is theory for? What good is it in the fight against capital and state? For much of the left, the Marxist left in particular, the answer is obvious. Theory tells us what to do, or what is to be done, in the strangely passive formula often used here. Theory is the pedagogue of practice. Thus, the essential link between Comrade Lenin and his putative enemy, the renegade Kautsky, the masters thinkers of the Third and Second Internationals. Despite their storied disagreements, both believe that without the special scientific knowledge dispensed by intellectuals and dedicated revolutionaries, the working class was doomed to a degraded consciousness, incapable of making revolution, or at any rate, making it successfully. The task of theory, therefore, is to weaponize proletarian consciousness, to turn it towards right action. This didactic view of theory extends across the entire range of Marxist intellectual work in the 20th century, from the comparatively crude Bolshevist programmatics of Lenin and Trotsky to the sophisticated variants offered by Antonio Gramsci and Louis Althusser. The knowledge theory provides already abounds in the world. Theory simply reflects, synthesizes, and perhaps accelerates the self-clarification of the struggles and wishes of an age. It's sort of a contrasting view that he sets up right off the bat with regards to theory. On the one hand, there's this idea that theory is something developed by intellectuals who can clearly see the situation and articulate like what the problem of the modern age is, and come up with a specific strategy or a way of viewing the situation, which is then disseminated to the masses and kind of compels them to viewing the situation in the right way. On the other hand, you could look at theory simply as the formalization of something that was already there. There's another quote a bit later on. Theory is a map produced by the lost themselves, offering us the difficult view from within rather than the clarity of the Olympian view from above. So nobody is in this sort of external position where they can look down and say, oh yes, this is how this thing capitalism, this is how it started out, this is ultimately the point it is like moving towards, and this is what that progression looks like, and this is how you address it. Because for those of us who are living through this moment of history, we do not know what it is moving towards. We can like theorize and we can speculate, but ultimately we are all sort of in this process as it's unfolding, and our theories are kind of just like a life raft that we're clinging to in order to get some sort of sense of how to move through this thing.
Right. Except for the centrist liberals who, you know, like to think that they have attained that Olympian height, and they are like the ones who can, you know, look on the extremes, look down upon them and like see them for what they are. Just complete fucking bullshit.
Which is, I guess, why, like, you know, the further reaches of the right and the left both have such disdain for the centrist liberal, because the centrist liberal is someone who has like a fairly comfortable life, like, you know, baby boomers who are sort of in the last wave of that capitalist golden era of the 1950s, 60s, etc., who their view of the situation is just like, oh, we've reached the end of history. Everything's good now. Everything works. Why would you want to change anything? Why are you complaining? Just get a job, you know, just like people who cannot see the problems of the present age, or insofar as they are able to recognize problems like, oh, there's, you know, environmental problems, or, you know, there's still racism and war and things like that. All of the solutions they offer are to work within the logical framework of the system itself, which ties back to the essay we read last week, where you'll see these sort of liberal response to riots and protests where they're like, okay, we get that you're upset, but, you know, do you have to get so violent about it? Maybe you should just write your congressperson, or, you know, go to school or something.
Right. Such nonsense. So frustrating, like the liberal hypocrisy and like the, I don't know, the smug self-superiority of them. Anyway, don't want to get too much into that. Just rant for hours about how disgusting liberals are.
It's easy to go down a liberal bashing rabbit hole, especially on election weekend.
I mean, that will that's the way to unite the left and the right, though.
Yeah.
Anyway, so this idea of cognitive mapping, which is a concept that he takes from Frederic Jameson, Postmodernism or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism. It's just what he said. It's like the idea of theory as being like a way of formalizing, or just generally like systematizing, just like writing out, spelling out clearly knowledge that is already there. Like theory, again, comes along after it has already been invented through action. It just needs to be, you know, basically written down. And the idea is I guess the two contrasting views here are theory as like a programmatic thing where it's just like a list of instructions, versus theory as just like a summary or something. Like the idea of a map, it's an analogy, it's like a metaphor, so kind of have to like unpack what it means a little bit. But like there's like this dichotomy between, you know, theory as a list of directives versus theory as just a summary of things that have already happened, just like representing knowledge that has already been, I don't know, attained, that is already out there, that has already been like in some way demonstrated through action, but it is like not programmatic about it. It's not a list of directives. I don't know.
When you describe it that way, like the latter certainly sounds more appealing to me, because like when you have like this sort of programmatic list of directives, that's like that applies more to like a static world where like there is this like sort of false idea that someone could be removed from the situation and have kind of a top-down view of like the entire process that's still ongoing. So any sort of like directive is going to be fundamentally limited in that way. So intuitively, like when it's described in this way, like the latter seems more useful. Like, oh yeah, just like, you know, study theory and examine what's going on and try to like make a list or document the various phenomena and like recurring sort of aspects of the thing that we're facing, while understanding that like nothing is fixed, nothing is totally known. But then in saying that, I realized, like, just looking at my own personal experience, like I got into reading theory and philosophy and all of that a few years ago in order to try to better understand like the world that I was born into. And like, I think, and I'm sure this is like the reality that most people come to when they start reading this sort of literature, is that like it just, everything you read raises more questions. Like you go in looking for like a sense of direction or a sense of meaning or like a path forward, and like just every book you read just seems to like exponentially magnify the like level of complexity of your understanding of the world, which can lead you down these sort of like, you know, armchair intellectual like rabbit holes where you find yourself like several decades have gone by and all you've done is read like very dense texts, and you can no longer communicate to like someone who has not also gone down that path.
Yeah, that makes me think that like they're like both of these contrasting poles of theory are both have like something important about them. There is perhaps a dialectic, if you will, between them, because like writing down just like a series of steps, like a programmatic directive, is limited, as you say, but it is also useful in particular contexts, and it is like sometimes what you want to do, like in your individual case as like a person trying to make sense of their position in the world. Like what you want to do is, you know, study a bunch of stuff and then write down a list of steps for yourself to do. Like the books aren't going to give you the answers, because, you know, at least like the well-written ones won't, because they're not like a series of steps. Like Jordan Peterson's book is not well written because it is like a series of steps. But the good ones are going to be open-ended. They're going to make you think. They're going to make you have to like force yourself to come up with that series of steps that applies to your particular case. So like there's like a microscopic level and the macroscopic level that is like analogous here between the individual and society, or like a revolutionary movement, where like on the individual level, like what you want to do is study a bunch and then like come up with your own way of living, like your own programmatic like list of steps, your own theory of how you should live your life that, you know, applies specifically to your limited context. Like it has a limited use, but it's still very useful to you. And then like expanding that to a macroscopic level, like there are going to be contexts where, you know, like writing down a list of steps is useful and necessary. Like if you're doing a movement, if you're doing a revolution, then that is what you want to do. You want to have like concrete actions that you can do. It's not because like going too far in the direction of just making these maps, these cognitive maps, is going to, that's precisely what armchair intellectualizing is.
Yeah.
And it's really when you write down the list of directives, it's like somewhere in between the two that you're going to actually, you know, use theory as like a practical aid.
You know, like removing it from like the political implications, like the sort of more abstract philosophical like idea of the concept of being conservative or being progressive, where on one level, like the conservative idea is like, okay, well, you need to do something, so you need to act as if like you did have an answer. So we're going to give you this like list of directions and like how to like live your life, and we're going to act as if they were fixed and like they were like eternally valid so that you can have faith in them and you can move forward more confidently. Whereas like the fundamental progressive idea is more like, okay, we're in this like complex evolving situation that nobody really understands, this thing called life. You know, we can't really be too confident in any system, so we're just going to kind of like observe what happens and see where it goes. Effective action is somewhere in the middle, where you're recognizing that like this is kind of an unknown situation that we're perpetually in, and that you need to be always sort of aware of like how it's evolving. But at the same time, you do need some degree of structure and some sort of like path forward. You just, to use the Deleuzean expression, you can't allow it to get too stratified, because then you're just sort of you're like a reactionary who wants to like remain at like one fixed point forever.
So the task of this essay, I guess, more or less, is to theorize what it was that these blockaders were doing in Oakland, which was, you know, blocking the flow of commodities. And he's like, you know, doing a little bit of a history of logistics. He cites quite a few like business texts and like financial kind of stuff, like real technical stuff about logistics itself. And, you know, he historicizes it, you know, locates it in the, as we said, like late 70s kind of era, when there's like a big global downturn and the United States was becoming deindustrialized. This is something that we've spoken about quite a bit, the history of like global industrialization and whatnot. But yeah, so following from that, there's this like innovation in Japan of this technique, logistics. It's called, what is it called? Like the Toyota technique or something, or the Toyota model or something.
Okay. I'm going to read this part because I think it ties into what you were just saying. It has always been unclear what the term globalization is supposed to mean as marker for a new historical phase. Capitalism has been global from the very start, emerging from within the blood-soaked matrix of the mercantile expansion of the early modern period. Later on, its factories and mills were fed by planetary flows of raw material and produced for a market which is likewise international. The real question, then, is what kind of globalization we have today? What is the differentia specifica of today's globalization? What is the precise relationship between production and circulation? Derived in part from the Japanese and in part from Anglo-American cybernetics, just-in-time manufacturing is a circulationist production philosophy oriented around a concept of continuous flow that views everything not in motion as a form of waste, a drag on profits. Just-in-time aims to submit all production to the condition of circulation, pushing its velocity as far towards the light speed of information transmission as possible. From the perspective of our blockaders, this emphasis on the quick and continuous flow of commodities multiplies the power of the blockade. In the absence of standing inventories, a blockade of just a few days could effectively paralyze many manufacturers and retailers.
Yeah, so the just-in-time method, I feel like kind of like all of what he's talking about, like he's putting it in a lot more like concrete and like technical terms, certainly. And I don't mean to presume to have already like known about the history of this, but at the same time, I feel like most people who like think about capitalism are kind of familiar with the ideas that he's talking about, like the idea of logistics, the idea of flows of commodities, and like this whole just-in-time thing. Like I will admit that I don't think I had really heard that term before this year, before, you know, the pandemic made it like such a big item in the news. But now, like, I think everybody kind of has an understanding of what that is, because like, you know, the like all the Lysol ran out, or like the toilet paper ran out, because like everybody had to stop working all of a sudden, and like, you know, other things like medical equipment and whatnot. But you know, everybody had to stop working all of a sudden, and these production facilities, these companies are set up in such a way that they're, you know, they're producing things just in time. They're really not producing, in the old way, where they'd make a shit ton of things, fill up a warehouse, and then ship it out to the retailer, and then they'd have to move it all. All that kind of like mid 20th century, early 20th century kind of image of production, where you have like just a warehouse full of crap. But it's like everything, there's like he talks about all this emphasis on like agility and like speed of production and the ability to like change over production and stuff. And I think this also relates to like something that maybe I am subjectively perceiving as like an accelerated rate of commodity innovation, where like everything is being produced just in time. There's no wastage there. These production facilities are only making the precise amount of commodities that they need to, and the minute the demand drops, they're able to drop that demand as well. And I feel like that must tie into like how we're getting so many new useless commodities all the goddamn time, because they want to, the capitalists, the overlords, they want to just secure their profits by at once like not producing a surplus so that they're not like financially vulnerable if the demand drops, but they also want to, they want to guarantee that people are going to be motivated to come back to the marketplace and buy their new iPhone every year. So they're going to be constantly innovating. They're not just going to be only making the precise amount that they need, but they're also going to be, making new commodities just to motivate people to go and buy them. Right. So let's try to talk a bit about this idea of hydraulic capitalism. I guess we don't have to talk too much about it, but I just, you are our resident Deleuze head, and it is from A Thousand Plateaus. Just the idea of like flows and just the concept, the term itself of hydraulic capitalism is taken from Anti-Oedipus, and the concept of flows is, I haven't read most of Anti-Oedipus, but I know that that concept is very fundamental to their thinking. They're like Deleuze and Guattari's whole thing in terms specifically of their analysis of capitalism. If you don't want to get into this, I really shouldn't, because I'm not qualified to. But basically, they talk a lot about flows. I think they like extend it beyond capitalism to like, desire or whatever. And like,
it sort of becomes, it becomes like their model of basically reality itself, where like, it's all about like flows and intensities, where like nothing is really like a fixed and sort of like isolated object. Nothing is like distinct. Everything is like this interconnected web work that's continuously like breaking up and like coagulating in new ways, and like everything is a part of everything else, and everything is communicating with everything else. Right. And I guess like the idea of the flow, more broadly speaking, is this idea that there is like sort of a directionality that certain processes will undergo that can take on like a degree of intensity and snowball.
Hydraulic is the term that we're using. Hydraulic just refers to like the flow of liquids. And, we can think of logistics capitalism as like a very fluid, a very agile. So it's like moving around a lot, and a very like a kind of adaptive and, responsive flow of commodities around the world using, shipping containers and like, whatever, trains and whatnot. So we can think of like the route of a tanker from China to Oakland, full of like these shipping containers that get loaded onto trains that are taking them across the Great Plains of the United States of America. And, the same is happening here in Vancouver, and, taking commodities across the Great Plains of Saskatchewan. But all those things are like kind of like rivulets that I guess are being carved out by these flows of capitalists, of commodity distribution, you know?
It's like the global, at the ever-present risk of anthropomorphizing capital, like the global capitalist logic, which is seeking to maximize profit, creates these flows, these sort of patterns, not just of like, the actual physical flows of like shipping routes, but the sort of commodities being produced, like the amounts of commodities being produced, where they're being distributed to. And you could probably even get into things like marketing, like the whole entire like acting pattern of capital at any given time is like this webwork of flows like that develop these patterns across the globe. And I guess the idea of counterlogistics is to recognize those patterns of commodity, those like profit maximizing processes, and to find ways to disrupt the flow. I do have a quote here from the section, The Use Value of Logistics, that I can read.
Okay.
Logistics is a simple accelerator of commodity flows. Logistics is a method to decrease the turnover time of capital and thereby raise total profits. Short turnover times and quick production cycles can produce very high total profits, even with the very low rates of profit per turnover which capitalists encountered in the 1970s. But these developments cannot be understood in terms of quantitative increase and decrease alone. Increase in speed and volume of commoditable flows decrease in overhead. There is an important qualitative goal here as well, described by logistics as agility. That is, the power to change as quickly as possible the speed, location, origin, and destination of products, as well as product type, in order to meet volatile market conditions. Corporations aim for responsive supply chains, as the chapter title of one popular logistics handbook has it, such that they can respond in shorter time frames, both in terms of volume change and variety changes.
Right. So I guess the idea is that like the previous mode of manufacturing, where you just like, he kind of describes it at one point, but you basically just like produce a bunch of some commodity. It's like the commodity that you are, banking on, and then you like ship it to a bunch of retailers, and then it's on the retailers to move that commodity. If they can't, eventually like demand will drop and they'll need to like do clearance sales in order to like get the last of it out there. But basically it's like producing a bunch of, it's not agile. It's like producing a bunch of thing and then like shipping it. It's very like kind of a monolithic way of producing commodities. But then, I mean, it's like, it's inefficient. Like you can see how that's inefficient on the face of it. Just the idea that you have to like do clearance sales suggests that something is wrong with that model. So obviously, capitalism as like an eternally like self-refining system is going to innovate on that and come up with a better way of doing things, which turns out to be logistics, where, as we have already said a bunch, like it's about agility. Like you basically only produce the amount of, you're able to like produce things really quickly, you're able to ship them really quickly, and you're able to like change what it is that you're being produced. So you only like really produce the amount of commodities that you're going to sell, and then as soon as you sell them, then you're able to produce some more, so that you're never like stuck with this like unused like backlog of commodities that nobody really wants, and that you have to drop the price on in order to move. Like at that point, if the demand drops, then you just invent a new iPhone and then like rekindle that desire.
Basically just like another level of abstraction from, like, say you had a factory and you want to like maximize profitability within the factory. So, you get some sort of logistical analyst in to like look at the factory production process, whatever they're manufacturing, and figure out ways to make that process more efficient. Like, oh, we can, do the same level of volume with less workers. If we adjust the workers in this way, we see here that certain resources are being wasted or being used less effectively. If we change like the schematic or the formula for this item that we're producing, we can produce it like X percentage more efficiently. So there's this sort of like logistical analysis of the individual factory with the desire of, most efficiently and most effectively manufacturing the product. And you could look at like this sort of the logistics that we're talking about now as a level of abstraction removed from that, where you're looking at the entire global market, the entire global capitalist process, just as being like this gigantic factory, all of these like sub factories communicating with each other, all of these machines comprised of other machines, to use the Deleuzian terminology. And this like global logistical process is attempting to render the whole market, the entire global like trading market, more efficient and more effective in order to get more profit out of it. So it's
Right.
like it's the same logic sort of applying at all levels. This is just a more like macro scale.
Yeah, I guess it's worth like emphasizing that even though Mr. Burns has kind of like, I think you read a quote where he kind of like problematizes the concept of globalization. At the same time, globalization is very key to understanding what is going on here. Like logistics really arose out of globalization between like trade of commodities between different nations across space. I think what is really fundamental here is like the space that separates these kinds of nations, because like and like the kind of like space that needs to be, that commodities need to be transported across, because like I feel like logistics really arose out of a need to move things between nations across like the entire planet, across
Yeah.
these vast spaces, and also to account for obviously like time differentials and like how a how the value of a commodity would decline over the time that it takes to move it from the factory in which it's produced to the store in which it is sold, and then over the amount of time that it takes to sell the commodity, and factoring for the amount of time that it produces the commodity. What I'm
Yeah.
saying? I don't know. I like logistics is very fundamentally tied to like global trade, and I feel like if you're just trading within one nation, maybe you could like do logistics, but it would be like a lot more limited. Like it would be,
Yeah.
yeah, it wouldn't be nearly as like complex. There wouldn't be maybe this, I feel like you could figure it out pretty easily, and there wouldn't be this whole industry of like professionals who go into like corporations and like do logistics as a job, like identifying these kinds of bottlenecks and ways of like augmenting efficiency and whatnot. I will just add on that one point that he is making, like we've spoken about cognitive mapping theory as a form of mapping out like knowledge that is already there. And one analogy that Mr. Burns makes is that logistics qualifies as cognitive mapping on the part of capitalism. It is the capitalist mode of production's means of mapping out and formalizing, just basically writing down like its own needs and knowledge that was already there, like knowledge of what needed to be made more efficient, of like how things needed to be done. So yeah, I guess it's relevant to just like bring up that point that is made, that there's a kind of analogy between the theory done on the part of like theory like we're reading here, like
Mm-hmm.
communist revolutionary theory, and then also theory done within the system in support of the status quo. I think that for logistics you need like certain data points, you need like real like kind of empirical things that you can study. So like he's using this idea of visibility to move from the kind of macroscopic scale to a micro scale. He's moving from looking at, these kind of vast, like commodital flows on a scale that, we can barely comprehend, like
Very
the amount of,
abstract, yeah.
the amount of, just the amount of commodities that are being moved around the world at any given moment, and the amount of like value that is in flow, that is moving around. But he moves from that to the scale of like, he starts talking about like bakers in like a factory, in a bread factory, and talking about like the development of production, like using this bread factory as like an example. Back in the day, like bakers actually baked things with their hands. They had to knead the bread and put it in an oven and take it out of the oven and all that kind of jazz. But nowadays, they just press buttons on a screen. So what do you think the connection is between these two different scales, between these huge commodital flows and then going down to like these factory workers?
I do have a small quote from this section. Visiting a bakery, which he had studied decades earlier for his first book, The Hidden Injuries of Class, Sennett, and I don't know what his first name is, I didn't write that down. Sennett finds that in place of the physically challenging processes of the 1960s bakery, workers now use computer-controlled machines which can produce any kind of bread according to changing market conditions simply by pressing a few buttons. As a result, unlike bakers in the past, the workers do not identify with their jobs or derive satisfaction from their tasks, precisely because the functioning of the machines is fundamentally opaque to them. The difference between entering values into a spreadsheet and baking bread is negligible to them. Concrete labor has become fundamentally abstract, scrambling at the same time distinctions between material and immaterial, manual and mental labor. So, a machine is producing all the bread, and like the baker's basically just someone who knows how to operate the machine. They don't necessarily know how to bake bread in any traditional manner. They don't know how to like knead the dough or all of the sort of the more artistic kind of traditional methods of producing any particular kind of bread. It's all this very like automated process. And like one thing that really stands out to me here is that, fundamentally this process of like making bread using a computer and machines isn't really that much different than filling out a spreadsheet or working in an office somewhere. There's this feeling of, as everyone becomes more sort of alienated from their labor, there's this increasing degree of abstraction, but also an increasing degree of interchangeability, where on the one hand, it could be anyone doing this job, basically. On the other hand, whatever you're doing, you could be doing basically anything. You could be baking a loaf of bread, you could be filling out spreadsheets. At one point, they mentioned that the machine can produce Italian bread, it can produce French bread, it can produce German bread, which I think is like a real interesting sort of illustration on like a micro level, on the level that you can actually grasp of like what this global process is, where here you have this person that's got no actual baking skills, who is with this generic machine, and the machine is sort of producing simulacra versions of distinct styles of bread that would have emerged from like particular, cultures or epochs or parts of the world. And it's just sort of producing them all as like this interchangeable commodity on the market. And to me, this sounds like pretty much the same thing as what's going on globally when you look at logistics, where increasingly it's just all this big integrated homogenized system where the particular commodities don't really matter. They're all just sort of interchangeable data points and flows of information, and even profit itself just becomes a sort of quantitative numeric thing that doesn't actually relate to any qualitative experience. This like alienation idea, it seems kind of sad, like, oh, I wish the baker was like, like actually baking the bread and had some passion for their work. And like on a like, sort of an abstract, like like systematic level analysis of this, yeah, it is sad that like everything is just done by robots and like nobody has any actual skills. But a point that Bernes makes is that for the individual baker, it's not like that, because
Right.
for the individual baker, they're, they don't have a passion for being a baker. They didn't become a baker because they wanted to be a baker. They became a baker because you need to get a job, and it was just what was available. So for the individual, there isn't this sort of like feeling of sadness that they don't have the passion for baking, because the passion was never there. It's just this like, it's this necessity to like earn a living somehow. So fundamentally, it really doesn't matter if you're like kneading the bread by hand or if you're punching buttons onto a screen.
But just as like a kind of digression that I think will be, would be illustrative to the listener, I feel like this process of refining through abstraction via like technological means is something that we were experiencing at our workplace in the last period, where what I'm talking about. Like, doesn't this seem familiar to you? Like this idea of like I don't know, like making things that were once informal and done with love and care,
Yeah.
like in some way making it so that it could be quantified and analyzed and like understood in terms of efficiencies and like thereby refined upon.
Yeah, this is like, I mean, really, like, I think it's just another side of like the same phenomenon of like so-called woke capitalism, as you have like this artisanal small batch capitalism where like people have become so painfully aware of the fake artificial like dehumanizing nature of like mass commodification that like I think in the last 10 years 15 years or so you've seen this like proliferation of like like these like small businesses that want to like project this image of like, oh no, we're actually like, we're artisans, we actually care, we're doing it the old fashioned way, we're going to do this by hand, we're going to actually like bake your bread, we're going to like have like a master baker who went to school for this, who has real skills their grandma taught them. It's like sort of trying to put the human face back onto capitalism. But having worked in these environments, it quickly becomes apparent that insofar as these small artisanal businesses want to be successful on the market, they still need to sort of apply that ruthless, profit-oriented, dehumanizing mindset. The only difference is that you've kind of put on this mask of like old-fashioned, like handmade humanness to conceal the process.
Yeah, I think that like, I mean, this like begs the same question that we were just asking about the baker, of whether or not like within communism, post-capitalism, would there be like these same artisanal things? Like, does the desire to do something precede, or is it the result of the profit motive? And like I'm a bit like unclear about this personally. Like I could go either way about the scale of manufacturing within communism. I think that manufacturing and production will need to be on a much smaller scale, but maybe there will still be some mass manufacturing. But I feel like there would still be like a desire on the part of individuals, a legitimate desire that is fine, to do like artisanal manufacturing on like a kind of micro scale.
Yeah.
So I feel like that aspect of the business that we worked for, and this this like side of woke capitalism, as you put it, it's legitimate, it's fine. There's nothing wrong with it in its on its own terms. But like what I was talking about is like, even within these kinds of businesses that like I worked for our job for a hell of a long time. I saw them move from being like a very kind of like informal, from it being a very informal workspace where, you know, you would write your hours. You wouldn't even write them. You'd like text them to the boss after you stopped working. And, you know, obviously there's a lot of room there to lie and cheat if you felt so inclined. You know, you go from that to like them having this app where you have to like punch in on your smartphone, and your smartphone like uses your location to, you know, verify that you're actually within the premises of the work site. Like, and that is just like an example of, and that's not customer facing. It doesn't really affect the artisanality of the products that are being produced at this place, but it goes to show like how logistics, or the logistical mindset, kind of eventually comes for us all. Like,
Yeah.
this business needed to, in order to stay competitive, it need to like just continually become more efficient. It need to like deal with the waste that was definitely occurring in the past under its more informal reign. Um, so yeah, like that idea of logistics is really pervasive, and it can really like, and I think the idea here is that like every like expenditure of labor power needs to be commoditized. It needs to be quantified in order to be like subject to the logistical mindset, in order to be like a site on that logistical cognitive map. It needs to have some kind of quantity. It needs to have like a, yeah, whatever. So
Yeah.
that being said, like the connection between, you know, like these two different scales that we're talking about, like the vast scale of like, you know, international commodity circulation, and then going to this like just one particular factory where the workers are like punching buttons in order to bake their bread. It's all like coming down to the same need to quantify every expenditure of labor power, and which is like fundamentally alienating in like the classical objective sense, because like it's not you as a human being who is, you know, being valued here. You're not able to like do your own thing really. You are really like, they would prefer that you are soulless. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? Like they really just want your body's capacity to press buttons. They don't want you as like a rational being. In fact, that's worse for them, because uh, like there are inefficiencies that come along with having a soul. But
Yeah.
really, like you can, in these kinds of workplaces, you cannot have any kind of deviation from the norm. They really need everything to be absolutely standardized. They need it all to be completely quantifiable, just so that it can like, they can like figure it into their like future projections about earnings and whatnot.
Yeah. And I think, you know, this is all very well said. And I think what you're saying here is like getting kind of to the core of like what would compel someone to be an anti-capitalist, where it really is like this sort of like digitized, dehumanized, like global machine logic that kind of infects everything that gets any sort of like notoriety or any sort of success in the world, becomes like overtaken by this way of viewing reality. It's like quantitative concerns sort of blot out all qualitative ones. Like as a human being, we're interested in the qualitative. We want a range of emotions and experiences, and we want that sort of magical feeling of being alive and you know, experiencing art, experiencing love, experiencing like adventure, like all of this cheesy stuff that like, you know, is the nature of being a human being. all of this is gradually blotted out by like this quantitative understanding of things in terms of numbers and ratios and profit margins and timelines, where you see this like exponential growth of like commodities and this like endless proliferation of new technological wonders, and all of this technology that would have seemed like magic for much of human history, and yet everyone's depressed and anxious about it because none of it is a qualitative experience. It's just a new like quantitative signifier in like the unending pursuit of profit. Like nothing, despite how on the surface differentiated it looks, how artisanal it might look, it all just feels hollow because underneath of it is just this sort of like mindless robotic pursuit of like a number going up on a screen.
Right. And okay, so getting back to like this whole thing that he's talking about, like the punching of the buttons on the computer screen and whatnot, like he's kind of using it as an example of like the like increased degree of alienation under this new logistical regime of capitalism, right? Like the worker, even whether or not they like baking bread, whether or not they want to be a baker, or just like kind of falling into that job out of necessity, in this new workplace, they're not really a baker. They have no, they're just being alienated to an even greater degree, because like they have no connection to the thing that they are working with. I think like this is where the Heidegger reference comes in, right? And you are also a resident Heidegger head. But I feel like, yeah, even from the very bare little that I know of Heidegger, it seems relevant here that like, there's this kind of like mediating thing between you and the actual stuff that you're dealing with in some kind of like ontological sense. You're like, you go from like kneading bread with your hands, and whether or not you like it, whether or not you identify as a baker or whatever, like you're still fundamentally like dealing with this real physical substance. But then you're going to like some kind of like simulation kind of screen interface where you're like just pressing icons or whatever, and you're not dealing with anything. So that worker, that quote baker, has no fucking skill. Like what could they even do? Is really like deeply alienating. And just to kind of go on a rant, I've like spoken about this a little bit. This is going to be like a bit of a digression, but you've seen my computer interface. It's all like command line stuff, where you're like, basically speaking to the computer. Like there is a mediating level of the software program that you're using. You're not, obviously, when you're using a command line on like a Linux operating system or any kind of operating system, when you're using the command line, you're not obviously speaking in machine code and like telling the hard drive which electrons to move around in order to produce some results. You're using a mediating piece of software that does that for you, but it's still fucking way better than the kind of shit goddamn software that is being pumped down people's throats with all these fucking GUIs. I hate GUIs. I've started to use a graphical video editor, just because editing on the command line is actually editing video on the command line is actually a real pain in the ass. I haven't really got a handle on it, so I've been using this graphical program, and like having to friggin' like drag the mouse around and like click all the time is so annoying to me. I'm so not used to it. I've basically only used like the web browsers, like the only real graphical program that I've used for years now. And like the kind of software that we use, that we all use a lot, and that we're using more and more in these times where we're all locked in our apartments interacting with each other over Zoom, this kind of thing is important, I think. Like the
Yeah.
software that we use and the way that software corporations are like controlling our minds through and alienating us from our interactions with the computers, with the internet, with other people via these technologies it's important, and it's something that we should all be thinking about and aware of.
Yeah, this is like, this is like something that, because we were just talking about a baker being alienated from the process of making bread. Like, yeah, kind of sad, but that they didn't care that much about making bread. I think what we're seeing this year, and like, I don't know, maybe things will quote unquote go back to normal, but like, you're seeing like a vision of a potential future where you're not just alienated from like your job, you're alienated from like the human experience itself. Where increasingly like culture and society in any form is relegated to like you as an individual living in an apartment, interacting with it through like these social media platforms and programs that are offered up to you as like the window into like a human experience that would no longer exist in this reality. I would recommend, like, in this sort of general philosophical territory, that everyone read The Question Concerning Technology, because as difficult and as problematic a figure as Heidegger is, that one particular essay, I think, is like highly relevant and useful, and actually like quite a bit more accessible, certainly, than Being in Time or most of his other work that I've read. So I would recommend the listener check that out if you haven't already.
Yeah. About this whole thing about like using command line software versus using a Windows operating system, like on one level I feel like I really emphatically want to recommend that everybody immediately delete Windows and install Linux and learn how to use command line software. But at the other end, like I don't really have a leg to stand on in saying that, other than that, like Windows is actually evil, and there are Linux distributions that are basically Windows, but which are free and based on
Like
free
Ubuntu.
software. Yeah, exactly, like Ubuntu. So you don't need to be like an elite level power user in order to escape the clutches of the evil Windows and Mac empire. But like I can't really blame people for not having the same kind of investment and interest as I do in their computers, right? Like it'd be kind of weird if I expected everybody to become a computer nerd. Like people have other interests, and yeah, I can't really like advocate for that really, but at the same time, like it is relevant to your life. Like your existence is being determined, your consciousness is being shaped in a very, very fundamental way by corporations that have unknowable resources, the likes of which have never existed in human history. Like these tech companies, Facebook, their resources are fucking unimaginable, and they are hell bent on destroying your mind.
Yeah.
And the same is true with Microsoft and Apple. They are controlling your mind at a very fundamental level. Like we all know about the color red and how it like releases endorphins, and how all the notifications are colored red in order to program you to like start salivating when you get like a fucking notification on your Facebook thing.
This is a sort of topic that I think people still talk about kind of half jokingly, because it seems kind of silly, like, oh yeah, like delete your Facebook, but like, it's no big deal. I think the problem with all of this stuff is that we're still at a very early stage of like whatever this like digital internet, like social media infrastructure thing is that's emerging. And while it still seems like somewhat innocuous, increasingly less so, but like what it could become, what it has the potential to do to like the human being on like a species level and on an individual level, yeah, it's like unprecedented and it's frightening, and it is something that I think we should all be thinking about now.
Yeah, the same goes for television, by the way. Like television through so much of the 20th century, like kind of like renegades, like anti-establishmentarian people were really emphatic about how television is like destroying your mind and like degrading your, mental capacities. And now we have like so many people fighting for the artistic legitimacy of things like television and video games, when it used to, like, that is a fucking psyop, dude. It used to be like very well understood by anyone who is like critical of the status quo of capitalism and its culture, that these things were bad for you. But they've like they have so many resources, and they've channeled them all so heavily towards like legitimizing themselves, so that like people, consumers, are doing the evangelizing for them. It's really a fucked up world we live in. Let's try to move on. Let's just try to cover this like fourth point here.
Right.
The reconfiguration thesis, basically the question of whether or not logistics would have any place within a future communist utopia. And the short answer is no. Do you have any like relevant quotes from here?
Yeah, from the reconfiguration thesis, I'll read what I have. Much of the machinery of contemporary logistics aims to streamline the circulation of commodities and not use values, to produce not the things that are necessary or beneficial, but those that are profitable. Individually packaged boxes of cereal, for instance, whose complex insignia distinguish them from the dozens of varieties of nearly identical cereals sold and consumed in sizes and types that reflect certain social arrangements, such as the nuclear family. Service and administrative jobs, which most proletarians today work, are meaningless except as points of intercalation within vast planetary flows. A mega retailer, a software company, a coffee chain, an investment bank, a non-profit organization. Most of these jobs pertain to use values that would be rendered non-use by revolution. To meet their own needs and the needs of others, these proletarians would have to engage in the production of food and other necessities, the capacity for which does not exist in most countries. The idea that the 15% or so of workers whose activities would still be useful would work on behalf of others as caretakers of a communist future is politically non-workable, even if the system could produce enough of what people need and trade for inputs didn't produce another blockage. So I think one point being laid out here is that as soon as you start like considering moving away from the capitalist system, you begin to realize like just how much of the current workforce's skill set, and like I'm sure most of us, if we look at our own individual life, like our individual skills only really has use value in the capitalist system. And this, this applies to the individual. This applies all the way up to like macro level logistical concerns, where if you remove that capitalist logic of maximizing profit and maintaining the current like systematic infrastructure, immediately, all of these data points and skill sets are just no longer useful. And we would need to like vastly reorganize like what we as individuals and we as a species do.
Yeah, it's true. And we saw a lot of that like in the onset of the pandemic, when all of these people like were temporarily laid off, and yet civilization continued to function essentially as normal. Like all of the real necessities continued to be present in the shops, and eventually like a lot of these companies like permanently laid off a large portion of their staff, and also made it like a permanent condition that people could work from home. Like Twitter, for example, I think it's now standard for all of their employees. They can either choose to work at the office or they can work from home. You know, which is kind of like a frightening thought that like as soon as we move beyond capitalism, there's going to be like a vast portion of like real concrete infrastructure. I think there's a technical term for that, like organic capital or something. I don't know. But as well as like a huge portion of the population are really going to have nothing to do. And the question is not so much like how are we going to feed them and provide them housing and like material necessities, but like what are these people going to do? What are like billions and billions of people going to do? It's kind of like a frightening thought. And it really, I mean, makes you understand kind of like not sympathize with, but like understand where these like billionaire eugenicists are coming from when they like say that there's like an overpopulation problem. I think this is something that I've spoken about in past episode, but like, yeah, like obviously that is not a defensible position. I'm not trying to say that, but like you can kind of see.
You can see where they're coming from.
Yeah, exactly. That like they're unable to really think beyond the system that they live in, or they're at least committed to that system. So within the framework of capitalism, it perhaps does seem like there is an overpopulation problem and like there is objectively a surplus population. And you know, there's like the question of like what to do with them is you know persistent. Or like what are these people going to do under communism?
I'm sure many of us had this moment early on this year in the coronavirus outbreak when it was like unclear just how bad things would get, where there was like some talk of like, oh, maybe there's like the imminent collapse of infrastructure and like society's going to collapse and the grid's going to go down. I'm sure, like, I know I certainly did, but I'm sure many people had this moment of reflection where it was like, oh shit, all I've done with my life is like work service industry jobs and work in offices. It's like, I don't know how to hunt. I don't know how to farm. Like anything that relates like to a more fundamental level of basic human survival. Many of us just have not been taught those skills. And very likely we were raised by, you know, elders, none of whom had been taught those skills. Like there's this multi-generational sort of alienation just from like the simple physical like process of maintaining a human existence on this planet. So we all as individuals, or very many of us, like 85% of us, are in this position where we only really know how to survive within the current system, even though we dislike the current system.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that like under communism we would all revert to being hunter-gatherers by any means.
I would hope not. No, yeah. I mean, I'd like to keep some level of culture.
Yeah, exactly. And like, you know, civilization and, you know, like the point of like Marx spoke about how you kind of like need to move through capitalism in order to build up the infrastructure in order to meet the basic necessities, the material necessities, and then thereby be able to move into communism. So the point of that being obviously that you like set up like ways of manufacturing necessities at scale so that, you know, when you move to communism, those things remain and you're still able to meet those needs, but at this, like at once, because you're not doing it for profit, like the amount of labor power that you need to put into those forces of production in order to meet the needs like goes down dramatically. Like the amount of, I mean, farms are already run by robots, and you could still have like you could still move away from monoculture towards something more sustainable like permaculture and still have it. Like permaculture is an automated system already. It's like an organic automated system, at least on my very limited understanding of it. and it's at least to some extent supposed to be automated. So, you know, the amount of labor power that you would need to put into like the forces of production to meet, you know, the needs of the population is going to go down dramatically.
Yeah.
So you're still going to be able to have like a basic standard of living. Obviously, that's what we all want. We wouldn't be advocating for a society. We're not anarcho-primitivists over here. We're advocating for a society where you can still have, like, we're going to lose some things, certainly. We're certainly going to lose a lot of, like, our institutional privilege and as, like, white guys. But, yeah, like, there's, like, the question of what to do with all the people is frightening, but it's for them to decide. And then another, like, I guess basically what is being said here is that logistics doesn't really have a place within communism because it is fundamentally tied to a global system of commodity production for profit, and it's fundamentally tied to like wage disparities across nations. Like if wages were equal everywhere on the planet, then you wouldn't need to trade from between China and the United States. It would make more logistical sense to manufacture in the United States, where, you know, things are where you, like, your market is closer to your center of production, so you wouldn't need to transport across the world. So yeah, logistics, you know, doesn't have a place within communism.
I guess I could read my very last quote,
Sure.
just in case it's a good soundbite. This is from the final section, Horizons and Prospects. The totality of the logistics system belongs to capital. It is a view from everywhere or nowhere, a view from space that only capital as totalizing distributed process can inhabit. Only capital can fight us in every place at once, because capital is not in any sense force with which we contend, but the very territory on which that contention takes place. Or rather, it is a force, but a field force, something which suffuses rather than opposes. Unlike capital, we fight in particular locations and moments, here, there, now, then. To be a partisan means, by necessity, to accept the particularity of perspective and the partiality of perspective and the partiality of the combat we offer. What then of strategy? If theory is the horizon which opens from present conditions of struggle, strategy is something different, less a horizon than a prospect. Strategy is a particular moment when theory reopens to practice, suggesting not just a possible, but a desirable course of action. If horizon places us in front of a range of possibilities, the strategic moment comes when struggles reach a certain crest, an eminence, from which a narrower set of options opens up, a prospect. Prospects are a middle ground between where we are and the far horizon of communization. So yeah, that's like, I think that really sums up really well, like a lot of the sort of like the unspoken dichotomy, I think, contained in this essay, where you have the dichotomy between theory and logistics, and the dichotomy between the qualitative and the quantitative, where ultimately, like, using logistics is untenable for us because logistics is a fundamentally quantitative way of inhabiting the world and viewing the world. It's all just about data and numbers, whereas theory and strategy speaks more to, I think, the human experience, to the unique, to the qualitative. And I think that's like more the frame that I personally want to inhabit. Anyways.
Yeah. All right. This seems like a good place to wrap it up. We've been going for, I think, about an hour and a half, if not more.
Yeah, this has been an extensive discussion, this one.
Yeah, this is pretty good. All right. So thank you for listening. My name has been Uriah Mark Todoroff. You can follow me on Twitter at The Inverted Form. If you're listening to this on YouTube, leave a comment. If you are not listening to it on YouTube, send me an email with your comment, or just go to YouTube and leave a comment anyway. Owen?
My name continues to be Owen Gilbride, and you can continue to find my music at my website, world3.tk. I just put a new album out recently, which I think a Montreal-based label wants to put out officially. And I had another label from the UK contact me recently about doing a tape, so maybe I'll have some commodities to offer up to you soon enough. But for now, you'll just have to download and listen to my music for free. But if you like it, shoot me an email, because I always love getting feedback from people. But until then, happy Halloween.
Yes,
whether you're
happy election, happy Halloween.
Whether you're riding with Biden or like
dying with Trump.
Yeah, the Mango Mussolini himself.
Nice.
Yeah, but stay safe.
Yeah, stay safe out there, folks. See you next time.
See you next week. Bye.
Bye.